All right. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We're a minute after the hour. So welcome, everyone. My name is Kirsten Loita. I head up our university relations team here at OUP. I'm so glad that many of you are joining us again for the fourth webinar in this series of webinars on academic startup licenses. Some of you are returning to us and have seen the previous three webinars, and some of you are sort of joining us for the first time. So welcome, everyone, to this. We have our three returning panelists, each of whom brings a different perspective to this conversation. In order for you to understand what those perspectives are, I'm going to have them each introduce themselves. Rick, let's start off with you today.
Great. Thanks, Kirsten. I'm Rick Friedman. I'm the founder and CEO of Novus GC. We're a boutique law firm that serves as general counsel for technology and life sciences startups. The work we do for our startup clients includes corporate formation, founder agreements, seed and venture financings, and university licenses. I started my career as a Silicon Valley corporate lawyer, and I took a detour into tech transfer 16 years ago when I joined UT Austin's tech transfer office as a technology manager. I went on to head up the licensing teams at UT and USC before returning to private law practice 7 years ago when I went to the law firm of DLA Piper, and then I launched Novus GC in early 2020. And in law practice, I've been fortunate to represent a significant number of startups that have been formed around university technology. I really love the work that I do in tech transfer. We do a variety of things in our practice. We do Series A financing, and one day I may be working on a Series A financing and a university license. And the licensing work is always fun and interesting. And I'm thankful to be doing this. And what I find also, and I'm just getting this, we might see it through this webinar, is the tech transfer community is very collegial. And as you're seeing, as we're talking about this licensing, there's a fair bit of complexity that needs to be worked out when we're doing the licenses.
Great, thanks, Rick. Nikisha.
So, hello, my name is Nikisha Holder. I'm an Associate Director of Licensing at Johns Hopkins Technology Ventures. We are a private university. My focus is on life science-based technology. As a 19-year member of the JHU community and 13 years with Johns Hopkins Tech Ventures, I'm so pleased to be able to share this information on this platform for an industry that has been so rewarding for me personally, as well as for the general public. In honor of this webinar series for startups, my background is the front lobby of Fast Forward, which is one of the JHU startup incubator spaces. I've worked in almost all levels of tech transfer, and I look forward to sharing today and then the next time in our final webinar.
Great, thank you, Nikisha. Lisa.
Good morning. I'm Lisa Norton, an Associate Director with Commotion, University of Washington's Technology Transfer Office, and I'll be representing the public university perspective today. After working at a Seattle biotech startup for 3 years, I joined Commotion 17 years ago and manage a portfolio that's primarily medical device technologies. I've always been interested in applied research and how to best bring technologies from the bench to the public. And through my work, I get to work with really smart, motivated innovators who are doing cutting edge work and really help them take that from a research project to a product. And I'm excited today to talk with you all about some important license agreement clauses along with this team.
Great, thank you, Lisa. So as everyone can see, we have people who have amazing backgrounds associated with this webinar, who really have a wealth of experience to bring to this topic. Not only are they bringing their experience today to this webinar, but they've been the people who have put this webinar together. They have outlined this, put together these slides, et cetera. So I'm really thankful, Rick, Lisa, and Nikisha for everything you've been doing for this series and of course this particular webinar today. So let's get on to our next slide, which is about OUP. We do realize that some people who are watching this webinar may not be aware of Osage University Partners, so we did want to give a brief introduction to our fund. We're a fund that invests in spinouts from academic institutions. We are in all stages, all sectors investor. So we invest anywhere from seed to pre-IPO rounds and any place that is basically deep science where our academic institutions are bringing out the cutting edge science from their institutions and trying to commercialize those and bring them to the general public. So what we do is we partner with our universities to make these investments in their their spinouts. We do share a portion of our profits with our academic institutions. Happy to talk more about that if anyone has questions on that. We're currently on our third fund. It's a $273 million fund that we're deploying right now. Across our three funds, now we have raised approximately $600 million. We've made more than 115, maybe even close to 120 investments in spinouts now, in different spinouts, and have had a lot of successful IPOs and acquisitions within that portfolio. Our investment team, and actually across our entire team, we're about 17 people, I think now. I think we're a number off on there. And our investment team is heavily concentrated on people with scientific backgrounds, especially PhDs, because we really delve into the science behind the investments that we make. So that's just our short spiel on OUP. If people have any questions about OUP and what we do, please reach out to me. So next slide. So this presentation, we're going to be sending it out to all the people who registered for this webinar. You can also find it on the OUP portal if you're part of an academic institution tech transfer office. If you're one of our partners, we have a portal that you can find a copy of the deck as well as this recording of today. You can also find this presentation on our YouTube channel afterwards. We'll have the recording of it up there as well. We do encourage people to ask questions throughout the webinar. To do so, please use the Q&A box down in for me, it's the right-hand side of the toolbar. Please don't, if possible, not raise your hand, even though we have that as a function. We find it much easier to be able to call questions by you putting them in the Q&A box, and then I can ask them of our panelists as we go along through the different subjects we're covering today. All right, so next slide. So today is our fourth webinar in this series, and this is our first of two sessions that focuses specifically on clauses of the license agreement. I'll review the content that we're going to be going through in just a few minutes, but you can find recordings of all of our previous webinars on the links that we provided to YouTube, or as I mentioned, OUP's partner portal. And then we have our fifth session coming up on September 9th, which will be another focus on the license agreement itself. And we'll be doing a deep dive on indemnities, warranties, liabilities, insurance, patent prosecution, patent enforcement, dispute resolution, ownership of IP, and name use at that time. So a lot we're going to be covering in that one, but we've got a lot to get through today as well. Let's go on to the next slide, which is just actually we wanted to give people some context about why we're doing this particular series. From the company side and the startup side, we hope that these webinars really can be a guide and a resource on how university technology licensing works with startups, and hopefully save some valuable dollars a startup often spends on being educated by their attorneys or others on how to navigate this process. In general, the majority of US institutions work in the same way on many of the aspects of licensing provisions that we're going to be talking about. So we hope that this will be really helpful and useful to those startup companies. And then on the tech transfer side, we hope that these webinars will be a resource in helping establish successful long-term relationships with their startups. It may actually be useful to those who are newer to the field for them to get some greater understanding about working on the licenses with startup companies. And we also just know how limited everyone's time is these days. And so we hope these will be useful for you across the board. Our approach to these webinars is based on using a combination of people, as you heard, with various backgrounds to provide that kind of insider baseball knowledge on the areas we're going to be reviewing. Successful spin-outs from universities are typically based on a long-term collaborative relationship between the parties. And you'll see that emphasized throughout the discussion today and in the other webinars we've already done. The best way to establish that long-term relationship is by putting your best foot forward at the beginning of the relationship and establishing that going forward. Let's go on to the agenda for today then. Next slide. We're going to go through just a primer on the agreement itself, the goal of the agreement and the major sections of the agreements to kind of give you an overview and outline of what the agreement looks like and what you're trying to achieve. And then we're going to go on to certain sections of the agreement and really dive into each one of those sections, including reservations of rights, sublicensing, assignment, reporting, audit rights, notices, term and termination, and confidentiality. And you'll see kind of how these end up fitting together too as we have the discussion today. So let's move on to our agreement primer. And so we'll go one more slide, and Rick, you can take it away.
Great. Well, last session we talked about the term sheet and the high-level business terms. And generally, after those have been agreed to by the university and the startup, the next step in the process is preparing a license agreement. And the first draft of the license agreement will almost invariably be generated by the university based on a university template. The license agreement serves many functions. First, it binds the parties to the business deal reflected in the term sheet and includes additional detail on those terms. Next, it includes the operational details, including details of reporting and record keeping required of the startup, details about the patent prosecution process, and what happens if there's a suspected third-party infringer of the patents. Tech transfer offices can be dealing in high volumes of patents and license agreements, and often will have developed standardized processes that are reflected in part in their license template. And then finally, the agreement will include a fair amount of what I know is affectionately referred to as lawyer stuff, or the lawyer parts, I think we're calling them. And this will relate to risk allocation and compliance with laws or university regulations, and that's in our next session. We're going to cover those in some depth. Patent license agreements can remain in effect for long periods of time. And that's something Kirsten just referred to, is that these are often long-term relationships. Patents last 2 decades, and license agreements can remain in effect that long or longer. And in my own personal experience, the most successful licenses didn't start to bear fruit, I guess, for 5 or 10 years after they were signed. So the definitive license agreement needs to stand the test of time and be structured in a way that protects the important interests of each party over the long run. Now, next, Nikisha will walk us through an overview of the major sections of the license agreement.
Okay, so as a recap, we've already discussed the sections highlighted in gray. That's the grant, consideration of financial terms, and diligence. Today, we will focus on the sections highlighted in green, opening recitals, definitions, and yellow. And finally, when we meet in our final session, we'll focus on those sections that are not yet highlighted. So again, today, as mentioned by Kirsten earlier, we'll talk about reservation of rights, sublicensing, reports, audits, assignments, notices, term and termination, and confidentiality. To start, I'd like to point out how important the opening or recitals are to an agreement. In some cases, an extensive recital may not be critical if there isn't much history to the relationship. For instance, if a startup company sees the technology on a website and simply asks the university to begin license negotiations and the process starts here, then there's no need for anything other than the typical template language that's in a recital. However, if there's extensive history between the startup or company and the university, then the opening recital highlights how or tells the story of how the parties arrived at the agreement. For instance, if there was an MTA that led to a sponsored research agreement, that led to an option agreement that resulted in a license agreement, then the information can be fully outlined here in the recitals or the opening. It really tells the stories of how the parties came to be partners. Additionally, if there are multiple parties that are a part of the agreement, or third parties that have rights, etc., then again, this information can be spelled out in the recitals so that those who look at the agreement 5, 10, 20 years from now understand why there are multiple parties involved in the agreement and how the process started. The second part I'd like to highlight is the definitions or defined terms in the agreement. Defined terms are used to make the interpretation of the contract easier. They are intended to make provisions in the agreement both precise and concise. They are typically found clustered either at the beginning or the end of a license agreement. And generally the first letter of the word or the whole word will be capitalized. Hence, sometimes they're also referred to as capitalized term. Defining the term gives the word or phrase a special and specific meaning. For instance, if we wanted to define licensed territory, we could define it as such. Licensed territory means the United States, Canada, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, South Africa, Italy, and Russia. It becomes clear that every time we reference the licensed territory in the agreement, we mean all the countries that we just mentioned. And further, we don't have to write them all out each time in the agreement. The defined term can also shorten a very long description. So I have a description of a handbag that I want to share with you all. So handbag means a blue 4-zippered Michael Kors purse that has a laptop carrier and an attached change compartment and convertible straps for carrying the purse on one's back. So at any time, if we wanted to use the term handbag in a particular agreement, we'd understand exactly what is meant by that. As a start, I wanted to go over these two sections. And now Lisa will tell us about some additional basics. Next slide.
Great, thanks, Nikisha. Yeah, some of the logistics that come up as we initially begin license discussions may concern things such as who signs. And the agreement will need to be signed by a representative or agent of the licensee, the company, which means somebody who has the authority to represent the company's interests. And the definition of an acceptable representative can vary by university and by their conflict of interest policy. So that's one thing that's important to note also, because you certainly may want the signatory to be involved in the negotiations so that they have a complete understanding of what they're signing. And some of the differences that I'm talking about from university to university are things like at the University of Washington, you can't have another University of Washington employee sign your license agreement. And often you can't have your partner or spouse sign an agreement. So just to save yourself some time, check in to understand that before you get to the last day where everybody's excited about signing and you find that maybe you don't have the appropriate signatory. Another logistical consideration that frequently comes up is around sort of the business of communication about tracking different terms of the agreement after the agreement is executed. So the Tech Transfer Office generally will be tracking the financial and technical deliverables for the license and alert the company about those due dates. We'll send invoices for things that are predictable, like annual fees, patent reimbursement, milestone payments, unless there's some alternate arrangement, but that would be, I would say, the standard approach. And the things where the expectation is that the company will have the onus to do that reporting are things that are less predictable. So royalty payments, the timing might be predictable, but the amount is not. So that's coming from the company either on a quarterly or annual basis. And also sublicensing consideration. Again, the primary relationship with the sublicensee is with the company instead of the university. And so we rely on that relationship for that kind of reporting. There are other things that may have completely separate tracking, such as a stock subscription agreement. Here at the University of Washington, that's due 30 days after the signing of the license, and that is something that we'll communicate about. This is just an area where it's useful to know, very exciting when you get the license agreement signed, and then really helpful to know what to expect next. So just check in with the Tech Transfer Office about what the next step will be in terms of tracking and invoicing. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that's one of the most important clauses to the university in any license agreement is the Reservation of Rights. And the reason that this is so important is that it enables the university to continue to do their research and make and use any technology for their own internal, non-commercial research and educational purposes. And I've put some representative language here that is fairly standard. You'll see that the language covers not only the university, but other not-for-profit organizations and their research. So importantly, this is not enabling those organizations to utilize the technology commercially, but really to further the research and the information that's gathered around that. So this can be particularly relevant for sponsored research agreements with, again, the understanding that the sponsor doesn't receive any commercial rights to the technology. And I think, Rick, you might have wanted to add something as well.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, there was a few things that I wanted to add.
Great.
Well, one is that just to put this in context, the reason there's a reservation of rights is typically we're talking about an exclusive license grant. So the startup is getting exclusivity for its territory and its field of use, but there's going to be a couple important exceptions, and this is one of them. It's these reservation of the rights. The university could use it for the different purposes that are outlined there, and that the university has the ability to extend those rights to other nonprofits generally. So that's just kind of an understanding kind of the parameters of that, because that can be a little bit of a surprise. And as Lisa said, this is very important to the research institutes to be able to continue to use these rights. So it is important for the startups to kind of get their head around it. So often these are not negotiable, but sometimes there can be some areas of negotiation, some narrow areas of negotiation. The other important thing about it, though, to understand is that you as the startup have taken a license to this, but the lab is still free to do whatever it wants. And the lab and the university may be further developing this technology. They may be doing something competitive with this technology. And there's no obligation to tell the startup any of this. The license is going to cover a very specific technology, and you're going to get those rights in it. The university is going to reserve rights and keep going. So it is imperative, especially if the PI is not involved in the startup, or even if the PI is involved in the startup, to ask these questions when you're in the startup about what, if there is additional work going on in the lab that's improving this or doing something competitive that you may want to be aware of as you're developing commercial products based on the technology.
We do have a quick question on this, and I think it's in the definition. What is the medical use of the technology?
Right, so that can vary from technology to technology. It's usually to cover some aspect of a clinical trial, and that can be preclinical research that can, depending on the technology, again, be utilization in animal models or in human patients.
Great, thanks. Any other comments on reservation of rights? I know how important these are to the universities. Obviously, the universities first are thinking about their own mission of research and education, and these rights reflect that primary mission of the university. Nope. Okay, let's go on to the next slide then.
So the next topic is sublicensing. Let's start by defining it. Sublicensing is the ability of a company to grant rights in the licensed IP to a third party. And there are several reasons why companies may sublicense. Two common reasons include to create additional revenue streams in areas or indications that are not a primary focus to the company. A second reason could be to help develop the technology and meet certain milestones. So typically a university will allow sublicensing rights in most exclusive licenses. We just give it to you automatically. However, the university may additionally include the following limitations on sublicensing rights. They may require approvals. Again, all universities are different, so these requirements may differ from university to university. From the university's perspective, it may want the right to approve any sublicense in order to understand how the technology is being commercialized and further to understand who is developing the products. The university needs to know. From a company's perspective, however, and I'm sure Rick will provide additional color on this, any limitation on its freedom to grant sublicenses may be viewed as burdensome. The company may not have the resources to fully commercialize its product in all territories, so the ability to sublicense may become a crucial consideration for them. Therefore, the company may be reluctant to risk having the university, quote unquote, kill a deal by refusing to consent to a sublicense. But to be clear, the university wants to see successful product launch and therefore will likely consent if provided a reasonable explanation of the sublicensing need. So this is kind of a concept that flows throughout open communication, and just providing the university with information is certainly going to be helpful in getting these things done. A university, depending on its policy, may limit the ability to sublicense in multiple tiers. What this means is that only the company or perhaps the affiliate may enter into a sublicense agreement. And that is where the sublicensing right will end. A sublicensee will not be further granted the right to sublicense. Sublicensees are frequently prohibited from further sublicensing as to ensure, again, proper monitoring by the university of its rights. Additionally, the sublicensee is typically prevented from being able to enforce the patent rights. So this means only the primary licensee can prosecute infringers. This is typically done to ensure an ability of the licensee or university to enforce the patent rights. If the rights in the patents are sufficiently distributed amongst way too many parties, then a single owner or single participant would not be able to establish what we call standing or majority rights in the patents in a court of law, and as such might not be allowed to move forward with their litigation. The university will typically require any sublicense agreement to be a written contract. They want to receive an unredacted copy so they understand what terms are in the contract. And further, that certain clauses from the primary license also flow down through the sublicense agreement. And Rick is going to provide more information on this as well. And this is to ensure that terms that are really important to the university are required by the sublicensee. And some of those clauses include financial clauses, reporting and audit requirements, confidentiality, disclaimers, limits of liability, indemnification, insurance, prosecution, disputes, term and termination, use of name, etc. These are common clauses that you're going to see mentioned several times today and likely in the next session. Finally, the university will require that the licensee assume liability for the acts of the sublicensee. It's the hope of the university that any licensee will critically vet their commercialization partners, since any bad acts by a sublicensee will be viewed as bad acts by the licensee. So sublicensing in a non-exclusive license agreement is fairly atypical, since any potential sublicensee can simply get those rights directly from the university. However, there are times when sublicensing rights may be included if there is anticipated a large number of sublicenses that might be needed or granted. Then the universities may grant this right to relieve a bit of the burden on the university to execute 20, 30 contracts, or if for whatever reason the end user needs sublicense rights or needs rights, then it may grant a limited sublicense right through the non-exclusive license. So for mandatory sublicensing, this is when a company is unable or unwilling to diligently develop or serve a potential market. And in this situation, we'd require a sublicense. So I have an example. It's a crazy example, but it's an example. If company A has a worldwide exclusive license in all fields to make an electrified mosquito net, which I think is pretty cool, and they are making the product, making and producing their product in Africa like gangbusters, but there is a major mosquito outbreak in Alaska. And for whatever reason, the company has no ability to get their product to Alaska. If company B comes along and has the ability and desire to make and produce those mosquito nets in Alaska, then company A would be required to provide that sublicensing right to company B. I don't know if anybody has any more context for that, but that's just kind of a really simple explanation that most folks can understand. So sublicensing and diligence milestones and milestone payments. The university is generally fine with a sublicensee or affiliate performing the diligence obligations or paying the milestone payments. The university is on board with getting the technology developed fully, as long as the parties are all subject to the requirements of the license agreement. And now Rick will give us some additional insight into sublicensing.
I just actually have a question for my co-panelists, which is mandatory sublicensing. You know, you've seen a fair number of licenses, and the reasons for it are clear, of the universities wanting the technology to be widely used, and if a particular licensee isn't developing it, to allow a sublicensee to do it. I'm just curious if anyone's ever seen that exercised. I haven't.
So we have, but infrequently, and I think mostly in cases where the technology is really a platform technology, where there's so many potential applications or fields of use, and the technology has been exclusively licensed in all fields to the startup or the non-startup company, depending. And that company has a very, laser focus on one application. When a new application comes up from another party, we would then talk to our licensee. They typically have the ability to indicate whether or not that's something that they could put together a development plan for, but often it's something that they don't have the time or interest to do. And then in those cases, we would execute a sublicense, or also, importantly, the company itself can execute a sublicense.
Okay, well, and that's the perfect example of it, and actually helps startups in their argument for broader fields of use in the first place.
Sure.
With that mechanism. Okay, great. Well, let's. Are we on to the next slide now?
Yes, Rick.
Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to take a look, just some thoughts from the startup's perspective on sublicensing. The role that sublicensing will play in a startup varies a lot from company to company. Some startups, for example, those involved in drug development, may be contemplating sublicensing from day one. For other startups, and I have these conversations with clients like, why do I even care about this? The one thing is that even as a startup, if you don't think, if you don't have sublicensing in your model because of whatever business you're in, the license is going to include it anyway, probably. If you're getting an exclusive university license, it's invariably going to include the sublicense terms. And Nikisha referenced that in her slides, that it's just going to be there. So it's going to get discussed, and it is something that gives you some flexibility depending on which way your business goes and your ability to go with it and bring in other partners as needed. So we covered sublicense economics in some depth last session. So we'll just do a quick recap now. As you may remember, there are two distinct strands. The first is that product sales by the sublicensee will trigger an obligation of the licensee startup to pay university royalties. So the sublicensee sells product, the licensee's got to pay the university royalties. So that means the licensee is going to need to get payment from the sublicensee to make those payments. The second strand is non-royalty sublicensing consideration that is paid by the sublicensee to the startup for the grant of the sublicense. And the startup must share a portion of this with the university. And this can include things like upfront fees, annual fees, milestone fees, or other payments in consideration for grant of the sublicense. And one last point on this that I don't think we covered last time is that if the startup may at some point bundle other rights when sublicensing university rights, it's important to consider including in the license a method of allocating consideration between the university rights on one hand and the other rights that may get bundled together, because often it'll be one package that's sort of licensed or sublicensed out by the startup and one stream of consideration in, and then how do you allocate that in terms of providing a portion of it to the university. So the next topic often considered from startups' perspective is the ability to sublicense through multiple tiers. And Nikisha touched on this on the higher level issue on her previous slide, which is whether you need to get even university consent to grant the sublicense. And I think there's this general, there's a real tension on this point generally with the universities wanting to control the extension of rights. And it's sort of, maybe it's less to control the extension of rights, but to just know what's going on and know who they're doing business with. So universities have fears about, working with bad actors, or, hey, we know the startup, we vetted them, that's who we're dealing with. If there's some other rights extended, whether it's through an assignment of a license or through a sublicense, that there's a concern on their part. And, that's balanced with this. I think the best way I can put it from the startup standpoint is the idea of autonomy, is that they've got this business, and you want to run it, you want to execute the business plan that you think is best for the business, for the stockholders, for the company, for the investors, for everyone involved. And that this idea of why should the university approve? Like, why wouldn't the university approve? You know, and what is it we can't do? Like, there's some rules, there's some unwritten rules we don't even know about as the startup. So there is that tension in that regard, and there's some there are some, I'd say, you know, somewhat established compromises. When we get to the next slide assignment, I'll talk about some of those compromises. But the other aspect of this is, you know, that first sublicense, we'd call that a first tier sublicense. Then beyond that, we would that sublicense might want to further sublicense. So, for example, if you're a startup doing drug development and you do a license, a sublicense with big pharma, that company may need the ability to sublicense to its affiliates in different geographic regions. And those affiliates may require rights to further sublicense to distributors or for some more local distribution. So in the drug development space, for example, startups may want the ability to sublicense up to 3 tiers. And often the first draft of a university license may or may not require consent at the first tier, but often is going to restrict these subsequent tier sublicenses. So depending on the business model and how important this is for the startup, may, you know, negotiate some leeway on that during the license negotiation phase. So the next item we have on this slide is the flow down of obligations. And what's meant by this is that there's several, and Nikisha mentioned this as well, there's several requirements in the license that the universities are saying, okay, you licensee, you've agreed to these. Now we also want to make sure when you enter into a sublicense that the sublicensee agrees to these provisions as well. And Nikisha mentioned some examples, and there's some examples of these on the slide of things that need to be flowed down. And so it's important, you know, to understand what those are, and then when you're negotiating the sublicense, someone keeping track to make sure that those actually do get incorporated into the sublicense, because that may be a last thought when negotiating the sublicense. But there's one thing that I'm always on the lookout when I'm reviewing these, is that it's one thing to say you're going to flow down these requirements, and it's another thing to allow a sublicensee action to trigger a university termination right without the ability of the startup to cure. That's something I'm always on the lookout for and concerned about. So for example, the license may say that if a sublicensee challenges the validity of a patent, the university can terminate the license. That always makes me uncomfortable from the startup perspective, because we may sublicense, and a sublicense might challenge the validity, but then I would lose all my patent rights. So often a compromise we try to work out in that situation is look, we agree that we, the licensee, if you want the right to terminate the license, if we challenge, we agree to that. But if a sublicense challenges, we want to be able to terminate that license, that sublicense first. And if we terminate that sublicense, then that should free us of having our rights terminated under the license. So that's kind of a different way that the flow down can work through, and understanding you know, what it means when you bring in a sublicensee and how the sublicensee's actions may affect your license. And then a final topic of interest to startups is what happens to the sublicense if the main license terminates. And there's a recent court case that says there's no default rule here, and it's imperative for the parties to specify what happens when the license terminates, whether the sublicenses will survive or whether they will terminate as well. And this can be an important point when a startup is sublicensing to established companies, because the established companies don't want to be at risk of losing the valuable rights it obtained through the sublicense if, for example, the startup fails or otherwise defaults on the university license. And typically, what I think is in many university templates, or often will get worked out on request, is that sublicenses in good standing may be assigned to the university, or the university may enter into a direct license with the sublicensee. I think we can now go on to
actually, Rick, we have a question. So
okay.
sorry,
Yeah.
before we do,
Yeah.
let's stick on for sublicensing for just a minute. So one person was asking about allocation of payments when there's other intellectual property rights also sublicensed that perhaps aren't the ones from this license. So the licensee is licensing both the university's intellectual property that they've licensed, as well as some other intellectual property under the sublicense. How are you typically, perhaps we can ask this of Lisa and Nikisha, how are you typically dealing with allocation for those types of payments?
I can tell you about an interesting situation that I just had. So I'll say that in general, unfortunately, it depends. It depends on whether the company has an existing product that our technology is going to be an additive to, or if we're creating a product where the technologies are going to come together. Those can vary how that valuation is done. And that's really what it is. We're trying to establish a valuation of the criticality of our intellectual property to the technology that would be licensed by the sublicensee. And so there are times where we try to come up with some mathematical formula to establish that. And that's, I'll say, my preference. And usually that's a discussion at the time of the sublicense, so that we're really valuing it at that time with a good understanding of what's going into that agreement. The exception that I'm going to mention, which I did in a license just a week ago, was that the company has an established product. Our technology is an important, potentially critical feature to their technology, but they really weren't sure how to do the valuation or do that math, and are planning on doing a fair amount of sublicensing and didn't want to have that conversation every time, felt that it would be burdensome to the company. So we agreed on a flat rate if their IP is the lead IP. That's different from a flat rate for sublicensing if our intellectual property is the lead for that.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, I concur with Lisa. I think it's a conversation based on what is being sublicensed and how it's being sublicensed. I mean, there's a difference if the university technology is a small additive part of what the company is sublicensing as part of a bundle. So they have 10 pieces of background IP that are critical, and the university has a small additive piece, or whether the university's IP is the critical component, and then they pulled in some IP from either something that they further developed or licensed from someone else, and that other piece is non-critical piece. So I think, again, conversations about what is going on, what is being sublicensed, how it's being sublicensed will be really helpful in having the company and universities come to an agreement on what's appropriate for each individual sublicense deal.
Absolutely.
And Rick, what have you seen?
Well, I want to make two observations about this. The first is that this is really hard. And the reason is it's different when we're talking about product royalties and combination products, because in that case, we have, you come up with, there's pretty standard formulas that say, well, we're going to look at the fair value, you know, whatever the market value of component A is, and the market value of component B, and then we could do an allocation because there's two, because we're you know, at that point, we're positing that there's actually a finished product that has the combination of these things. When you're, and it can be done formulaically that way, it's much more difficult to do this, because in this case, we're not talking about different components, we're talking about IP rights and patents and patent claims, and how, you know, and allocating that is difficult. So, you know, in terms of approaches I've seen a few different approaches. Some have just been kind of just allow like an equitable allocation based on the number of different parties whose IP is in. I've seen it with more of a manner that there needs to be an equitable allocation determined at the time, and you know, some kind of just kind of, it's kind of like a dispute resolution mechanism to come up with that allocation, or bring in a third-party expert if necessary. And the third thing, and these are all complex, maybe some of the simpler ones I've seen, and I think, I'm not sure if it was an example Lisa or Nikisha gave, but it was one simply where here's the base rates of the sublicensing, assuming that it's just the product, just the technology from the university, versus if you put anything else in the bundle, then we're just going to have a different set of rates. So, you know, this very much is a case-by-case thing to discuss. But the one thing that's important for the startup is that if you don't raise this, this isn't typically in most university templates to do any allocation on this. I haven't really seen it in any university templates. And if it's not there, there's certainly cases, and I'm aware of one case that went to litigation where there was multiple things sublicensed. There was nothing in the agreement about allocating. And the university claimed and actually prevailed to say, well, we get the percentage that says in the agreement because nothing, because that's what the agreement says. And I also want to just take it up a level. What we're talking about here is this about allocating is the non-royalty sublicensing consideration. I think that's what, because if we're talking about product sales, then we're going to get into the whole question of combination products, and that's going to bear on it. But this is if there's payments made on behalf of the sublicense and how it gets allocated.
Right. Good. Really good point there, Rick. We have a number of other sublicensing questions. I'm going to ask those now. We do have some questions from the earlier topics we talked about. I'm going to save those for that Q&A portion that we have at the end. Next question on sublicensing: should a university licensor proactively confirm that a sublicense does actively comply with the required flow down, or is it the licensee's responsibility to do so? Rick, you want to take this one?
Well, I think it's, from being on the standpoint of representing the licensee, I do think it's the licensee's obligation because the licensee is in breach of the license if it's not. And so I feel like it's imperative that the licensee do it. And there's another, so this raises another interesting topic we haven't talked about, which is something that's often will be in the agreement, and whether it says that you have to provide the sublicense to the university before or after it's signed. And I think, and I'm typically where we come out on this, I'm thinking in most recent cases, it's you don't give the sublicense to the university till it's after it's signed. And honestly, from the licensee standpoint, they don't really want another party having to be it. They just want to get something in place that works and not have one more party negotiating at the table. So I'm interested to see what Lisa and Nikisha say about this.
Well, I would say typically we're not going to be involved in the sublicense discussion, like negotiation. The license agreement will typically say what considerations should flow down to the sublicensee. And in particular, it may say inclusive of subsections, whatever they are. And so therefore, those subsections may be included in the license as they are, in the sublicense agreement as they are, or some iteration of the term that is consistent with the university license. And again, each university is going to be different. And so I think that's the basis of it. We don't want the extra work. We want the sublicense agreement to be put in place with the provisions as requested in the license. Lisa?
Right, and I'd say that's a balance point. So for the benefit that you get from the university not needing to review the sublicense before it's executed, we require that specific sections outlined in the license agreement be included in that sublicense. Otherwise, those are the things that we'd be looking for. And importantly, it's really to the company's benefit. First, as Rick mentioned, you don't want to be in breach of the license agreement. And secondly, if the sublicense doesn't include those components, then that sublicense is null and void. And that's definitely not how you want to start your sublicensee relationship, or to have and that's not a position that the university wants to be in either. So as the company put those provisions in, the university won't have to review it for those provisions, and your sublicense won't be affected negatively.
Yeah, I feel to some extent this is somewhat like self-governing, that it really is on the licensee to be worrying about this, because I don't know how often the tech transfer office is going to go through and check it. Certainly if things go wrong, they're going to check it. And they're going to, if something goes wrong in the relationship, then they may be checking it, but it's not, the offices are very busy with the things that are their responsibility. So it is really up to the licensee to comply.
So this is a quick question, and I'm going to ask it to Lisa, Nikisha, and then to Rick, what you've seen. So Lisa, at UW, does the assignment to the sublicensee, so if the overarching agreement to the licensee terminates, does the assignment to the sublicensee require the university's approval at UW?
Not if it's like an all but no less than all transfer type of agreement. In other cases, there's usually a discussion, and I would say that most frequently the sublicensee wants to have that discussion. They want to ensure that they have the rights that they anticipate. And again, we keep emphasizing this, but it's very true. Having those conversations early in the game is going to save everybody some time and some concern, usually on the side of the sublicensee.
Yep.
I concur.
Yeah. Okay, great. And Rick, have you seen anything different than that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So next one. And this goes into patent validity challenges with sublicensees, which we knew we were going to get to somehow, somewhere, right? I think we're actually going to talk about that a little bit on the next one as well. But can the sublicensee, I think it's actually supposed to be licensee, terminate its sublicenses if there's a challenge to the validity of the patents that are being licensed, and therefore invoking a higher royalty obligation that the licensee will be required as a result if its sublicensee challenges the validity of a patent.
So I think Rick addressed that earlier in his slide explanation, that one of the things that he particularly thinks a licensee should look out for is these clauses where if a sublicensee were to challenge the validity of the patents, et cetera, that the license will automatically terminate. And particularly if the licensee terminates its sublicense, then they're relinquished from the termination right.
Great.
I think it probably, we could talk about a little more. I imagine we're going to cover it next session as well. This idea of being able to terminate the license for a validity challenge, there's some people who question whether that's enforceable because of the whole line of cases. And I think we'll probably get more into that next session, that give the licensee the right to challenge. So, this is interesting because it's really evolved over about the last 10 years since the MedImmune case came down. And, universities are protecting themselves because licensees now have standing to be able to challenge validity. And the last thing the university wants to do is think it's partnering with someone and then their partner challenging the validity. So you see that in virtually some sort of restrictions on that or some sort of consequences of that in most university licenses now. But it is, it's a tricky thing when you start talking about what happens if the sublicensee does that. So kind of where I've seen a lot of licenses come out recently is that the licensee is going to agree to what it's going to agree for itself. And then there will be a separate set of conditions for the sublicensee, basically, that will require the licensee to terminate the sublicense if it takes this action. And that if it doesn't, then that will give the university a right to terminate the entire license. Yeah. So that's kind of where I've been seeing that come up.
All right, thanks. So we have one more question that falls under this category, and then we'll move on to the next section of what we're going to be talking about. If the licensee does not bundle the university intellectual property with its own intellectual property, but just licenses them under separate licenses and agreements, putting a higher value to their own IP, perhaps under that particular license versus the university IP license. Have you seen that happen, and what kind of concerns are there with that? Any way to potentially address that if they ended up doing separate licenses for the IP rather than bundling them in one license, and perhaps putting a lower value so that flow down doesn't happen?
Yeah, I'll say that we've seen this in two different ways. So one, importantly, is that if the company's IP can be licensed separately from the university, that may be completely legitimate, right? If our intellectual property really isn't part of that sublicensing agreement, if it's not part of the product that sublicensee would be making, using, or selling, then that can be absolutely appropriate. The times where we see this come up are really often where we have jointly owned intellectual property with the company. And over the course of negotiations with the company, we've had some indications that the company might choose to license only the company's part of that jointly owned intellectual property. And in those cases, we insert language around the fact that the university's intellectual property in that jointly owned patent has to follow through in those agreements. That happens rarely. Again, those are situations where for some reason we have a concern. And so we're using sort of a belt and suspenders approach. But overall, we're taking sublicensing consideration based on our IP. If our IP really isn't included, then that's legitimate. I would say one place where this is probably getting a lot more attention is in drug discovery space, where the university's intellectual property is leading to compounds that the company is creating new IP around. And we've definitely seen some creative thoughts in licensing around how there could be a component of the university attached to that, but that's maybe a whole other webinar.
Yeah, I feel like that gets more like the enabled, kind of enabled products. The one I understand the university's concern in this regard, and I think as the question was posed, it was almost one of kind of an abuse by the startup, where it was allocating $10 million of value to its IP and then charging $1, upfront for the university piece, but them really being sort of part and parcel of the same relationship. My observations on that is that I think understand that there is the potential for abuse if depending on the way the university license is written, but it's pretty theoretical, because in most cases the startup's not gonna, the industry partner is going to want one agreement, and you really create infinite complexity by trying to break these things into separate agreements if they're really all part of the same program. So I think it is more of a theoretical concern, but I have to say I've seen more and more university templates address this with some sort of very expansive definition of what sublicense agreement means, to kind of bring in all these related agreements, so they have to be looked at together. So I have seen universities.
Okay, that'd be good. And if there's language that of around that, that might be great for us to be able to at least provide to people so they have an idea of what it could look like. Let's move off of sublicensing then, Rick, on to the next slide.
Okay, and this is kind of a related topic of assignment. In sublicensing, you're taking a bundle of rights and passing them on to another party. In an assignment, you're assigning the entire agreement, the entire license. And the first draft of most university licenses is going to say that the startup can't assign the license without consent of university. And I'm curious on what other people's experience is. I've in my 16 years of tech transfer, I've once seen this play out where the startup actually assigned the license because it pivoted and didn't want it anymore. And it had developed the technology out somewhere, but it pivoted its business. It wasn't using a business unit, so it sold the business unit with the license with it. So I have seen that case. I think the more prevailing one that people think about is more of a sale of the entire company, and potential assignment in that context. And there's significant tension on this topic, similar to the sublicense one, but I'd say a lot more pronounced. And when Kirsten was giving her introduction about OUP at the beginning, one of the, certainly a marker of success for OUP is the investments it makes and the number of exits it has through IPO or sale of company. And so this is very significant. We get back again to the university's concern on who they're doing business with, and maybe not wanting to do concern about bad actors, or maybe just if this was at one of the universities I worked at, this was a concern because they had experience with this, where a startup became insolvent, and it was hard getting the patents back once it went into bankruptcy, and sort of having protections so that in that case, the company goes into bankruptcy, the technology is being exploited. How do we get it back out? How do we get the patents back so we can get them into productive use? Now, on the other hand, the sale of the startup is, among the most significant milestones in the life of the company, especially for its founders and investors. And I guess to put it simply, the idea of needing approval from a university official to approve of the sale of the company freaks people out. It's like, hey, we're going to work this and we're going to be at ready. Everyone's going to make all this money. We're going to get it in the hands of a suitable party to bring it forward. And that somehow that is going to be an approval. When if there's approval requirement, it means that they could say no, or they may take forever. And, and that freaks people out. And so this is often is subject to significant negotiation. And in my experiences, compromises can generally be worked out when negotiating a license to allow for an assignment in connection with the sale of company without the university consent. And some universities will allow it just if it is in connection with the sale of company, that they understand that this is expected, the company is going to be sold, and that should be fine. And this is a pretty theoretical risk that someone's going to, sell to this really bad actor. But other times, universities will impose requirements to negotiate something out. It has to be an acquirer of a significantly large size, or the transaction needs to meet a certain threshold. And then beyond those, there'll be, you'll often see conditions for assignment, like the agreement needs to be in good standing. So if you're in default, you can't assign it. The acquirer will expressly need to assume the obligations under the agreement. And then finally, there may be the payment of a fee. And we touched upon this on the last session, this idea of an assignment fee. And the idea is if the license is going to get assigned, there's this dollar amount that has to get paid to the university at that time. And when I started in tech transfer, I would hear people make the argument that it was an administrative fee for processing the assignment. I don't really hear that at all today, and I think it's really evolved. And today, the assignment fee is more of an equity backstop. Universities are going to be getting equity in the startups, and they can't control the startup's cap table. It's completely beyond what they have any influence over, and their equity may get substantially diluted in the course of fundraising or whatever different cycles that the company goes through. And the idea now of the assignment fee is typically more of additional consideration for the license by allowing the university to participate in a liquidity event. And so often today it's framed as either a liquidity fee or an assignment, a liquidity fee instead of an assignment fee. And I think there's some people refer to as an anti-embarrassment fee. It's the idea that, hey, people are making all this money. The university thought it had equity, got really diluted, and has nothing left. And so, that there should be some consideration to the university because the university enabled this to happen through the technology that was licensed to it. And the one thing about this from the startup's perspective is that we will typically ask that the liquidity fee be reduced by any return on the equity issued under the license, because the assignment fee and the equity are generally targeted at the same idea of allowing the university to participate in the sale of the license, of the licensee. So that's what I have on assignments. And next up, Lisa is going to talk to us about startups reporting requirements.
Thanks. There are definitely a number of components in license agreements that require reporting so that the license remains in good standing. And I've listed some of them here. They include things like diligence and yearly reporting. So that can be reporting on the company and or sublicensee's efforts to develop the technology. That's usually not required in years where there are active sales, as the fact that there are sales represent that the company really has done its diligence in getting the product to that stage. There also is reporting for performance milestones. Those are typically the stepping stones on the way to product development and product sales. And importantly, I would say for your own benefit, make sure that that reporting includes enough information to the university that it's just an easy review for them to have that check mark that the performance milestone is done. And not only does that typically indicate that the company is in good standing and the license is in good standing, but often those milestones are related to a decrease in other fees in the license. for the University of Washington, that typically leads to a decrease in the percentage we would take for sublicensing consideration, for example. Also, following the execution of a sublicense, as we've just been talking about sublicensing, the company needs to provide the name and the agreement and then sufficient contact information to identify the sublicensee. Again, this is really to the benefit of the company. We don't want to pursue somebody as an infringer who actually has a valid sublicense. So just having that good flow of communication is really key. In addition to things like diligence reporting and annual reporting, there's also sales reporting. Sales reports are often done on a quarterly basis and indicate the net sales and the royalties due to the university. In some cases, those might be annual rather than quarterly, but I think quarterly is a little bit more frequent. Those reports also are indicating the number and type of licensed products sold. It might also, if you've licensed a bundle of intellectual property, create a link back from the licensed product or products to the different intellectual properties. That's really helpful for the university, so we know how to allocate those funds to our researchers. And all of that reporting is a great way to have the university kept up to date to make sure that your licenses, again, is in good standing, and really just to continue those conversations. Those are an excellent way to indicate early if there are any challenges that the company is having in meeting those milestones and to initiate those discussions. And on occasion, some of that reporting can lead to questions. So something might seem different from previous reporting. There might be a big decrease in royalties on a quarter by quarter or year over year basis. And that can lead the university to ask questions about the report and sometimes to challenge the accuracy of the reporting. And if after discussing that between the parties, there still isn't an agreement about any such discrepancy, that can lead to an audit, which I'll cover in our next slide. Next slide, please. Thanks. So audit rates, really over the life of an agreement, as I mentioned, there could be a need for the university to audit the licensee due to a perceived reporting discrepancy. And often this is in regards to royalty and net sales, but that may not always be the case. And that audit has these general parameters. So the audit typically can't be requested more often than once a year. So that can vary, but I would say that's fairly standard. The audit is conducted by an independent certified accountant. So importantly, they're not working on behalf of either the licensee or the university, but really just trying to get to the ultimate answer. The audit is certainly going to be performed under confidentiality. That's very important. The auditor is going to be seeing a large amount of confidential information, and some of it may not relate at all to the reporting that is actually being analyzed. So that should be all confidential. Also, the university has the ability to audit sublicensees, which would be included in that sublicense agreement. That's one of the things that typically does flow through. Accountants won't disclose any information relating to the business of the company that's not related to the audit. My mom has been an auditor, and I would say this is very true. Again, as mentioned, you learn a lot more about the company, but there's only some slice of that that's relevant to the audit itself and the topics under discussion. The company and of course the university both receive a copy of the accountant's report. That just helps for both parties to understand the information that's being conveyed and be able to discuss it. And if there are still discrepancies, to discuss how to best come to an agreement about what those are. And one of the things that we get asked most often is then who bears the cost of the audit? So if it's the university that's initiating the audit, and if the discrepancy, if the royalties are underreported, for us it's by 3%, for other universities that may be 5%, then the university is going to bear the cost of that audit. If, however, it's a larger discrepancy, then typically that's borne by the company. And just in general, some universities regularly audit their licensees just as a component of practice. Often this can be in cases where royalties are anticipated to increase dramatically. And I think, Nikisha, you might have wanted to add something there as well.
Yeah, I know that for Hopkins, if we anticipate that there's going to be kind of what we anticipate as a blockbuster. For us, blockbuster is not necessarily blockbuster, but a large royalty payment. We may initiate an audit early on, just so that we're starting the anticipated royalties and tracking and how things are going to be reported from the beginning.
Great. And then Nikisha, I think that leads us right into your next slide.
Yes. So the term of the agreement is the length of time a license agreement is valid. It can be temporal, where there is simply an allocation of a number of years, or it can be tied to the intellectual property or patent term. A patent-only license will typically extend for what we call the life of the patents. The life of the patents is 20 years from the filing date of the earliest US or international application to which priority is claimed, excluding the provisional application. And Rick mentioned, multiple decades, 2 decades. A patent license that has patents and other types of IP, like know-how, materials, data, et cetera, may have a term that is the life of the patents plus. And plus can mean any number of agreed upon years. I've seen life of the patents for 20 years from the effective date, which is effectively the patent term, 20 years. And again, that corresponds with a typical patent life. We've also seen the life of the patents and X, perhaps 10 or 15 years from first commercial sale of a licensed product. In such situations, there's typically a step down in the royalty rate if the term of the license is longer than the life of the patents. And an example of potential common language is outlined here for you. I believe it says on a product by product basis until the latter of A, the last to expire patent of the patent rights, and B, X years from first commercial sale. And then the right to use the technology rights shall survive expiration of the royalty term. It's important to note here that in 1964, the Supreme Court ruled in Berlot versus Thies that a patent owner cannot charge royalties for the use of a patented invention after the patent term has expired. So this is the law, and it's the university's intention to be complicit with the law. However, in 2015, a case, Kimball versus Marvel Entertainment LLC, came before the courts with a dispute over the royalties in a license that had no particular royalty term or term of the agreement. So there was an upfront fee and a royalty percentage. However, how long do they pay? The court actually upheld the Berlot decision. However, the court sort of blessed this inclusion of alternative rights in an agreement, which would allow kind of this step down consideration on royalties. In these cases, the post-expiration royalties are allowable as long as those royalties are tied to non-patented rights that are included in the agreement, such as materials, data, know-how, trade secrets, etc. The important consideration here is that the value of the patents and the value of the other things can't be the same. A non-exclusive license, the term, will similarly follow that of an exclusive license if it's related to patent rights. If it's not related to patent rights, then typically the parties will agree upon a number of years that's appropriate for that particular licensed IP. So if it's copyright, it could be 10 years, that's renewable every 10 years. I mean, copyright lasts forever. Well, it doesn't last forever. It lasts, I think, 70 years after the person's death or something to that effect. So the patent term for a piece of the license term for copyrighted work might be much longer than a typical license. So now that we've talked about the term, unless any of my colleagues have additional comments, let's move on to termination by the university. Okay, so to be quite frank, the university has little leverage when it comes to their ability to terminate an agreement. This is an imbalance in the agreement that's to the company's favor. And this is why the university negotiates so firmly on certain clauses, because once we are in an agreement, it's quite difficult to extricate ourselves from an agreement unless there is breach by the licensee. The university can only terminate an agreement for breach or for cause. Some of these causes include failure to pay any number of the payment requirements in the agreement, failure to meet a milestone or performance obligation, failure to provide the required report that Lisa talked about, failure to have appropriate insurance, this is super important to the university, or breaking any covenant of the agreement. And even in situations of breach, the university, in most situations, has to offer the company an ability to fix or cure the breach. This is a timed termination. So the university will identify what the breach is, provide notice to the company, and give the company the time as allocated in the agreement to fix or make good on whatever covenant was broken. If the company is unable to cure, then the agreement can terminate. With all that being stated, most universities want an agreement to move forward. And they'll try and work with the companies who can prove they're diligently working towards meeting the application. And they want to make the license work. We don't like to terminate agreements that specifically appear to have sound forward purpose and progress. Finally, there are a few types of breaches that will result in immediate termination. Those include things like not having appropriate insurance. The insurance obligation is one that puts the university at immediate risk, and the university will absolutely not be agreeable with that. Sublicensing without permission or signing an agreement where there's no permissions or without notification could be also an appropriate time for an immediate termination of breach. And so now we'll give us termination by the startup.
Next slide.
Next slide. Yes, thank you.
Well, so not everything in the license is mutual and symmetric, and there are reasons for that. And I think this is a good example of a case where things aren't symmetric and there's a good reason for it. Sometimes people negotiate license or different agreements and say, well, you've got that right, we should have that right. And sometimes that makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. And in this case, Nikisha explained why the university is limited in its ability to terminate the agreement. And that's, if the university could terminate the license at any time, there's no way the startup would be able to get investment from its investors if this valuable IP could be taken away. But often the IP is the foundation of the company, and the investors and the founders and everyone needs to be assured that as long as they perform under the license, that they could keep getting access to the technology. So it makes perfect sense that the university can't just pull the rug out from underneath the technology. Wouldn't be a very workable system if it was. And so this one goes in favor of, this asymmetry goes in favor of the startup. Next session, we'll talk about an asymmetry and indemnification, where the university is going to be getting indemnification, but not necessarily vice versa. Very unlikely that the reciprocal will be true. University licenses typically will allow the startup to terminate for convenience, meaning with or without cause. The startup can just walk away from the license if it wants. And there are a number of good reasons why the startup may want to terminate the license. It may need the technology. It may not need the technology anymore because it's pivoted on a business plan or pivoted on the technology, or maybe it figured out that the technology wasn't scalable or couldn't reproduce the results that the university got with the technology. It could be that the startup doesn't want the patents anymore. After patent prosecution, the claims might have been substantially lower, narrowed, might not cover the company's products anymore. They may see the patents of little value. Or the startup may fail, and that's going to happen to startups. So there's always reasons that the startup may not need the license anymore, but as long as the license is in effect, the startup actually has diligence requirements to develop the technology. It's responsible for patent costs and has other payments on the license. So the startup, often will want to get out of the license if it's not using it anymore. From the university standpoint, in theory, they should want the patents back if the patents aren't being used by the startup, so that the university can give another company opportunity to bring products to market based on technology. And so often the requirements to terminate for convenience by the startup are fairly light. Often there is some advance notice, in the order of magnitude of 90 days. I've seen some, this is pretty rare. I've seen some universities require some waiting period of months or years after the license is signed to terminate for convenience, but that's really more the exception than the rule. And the one thing that I want to note before we go on is that although the licensee can walk away from the license, the university doesn't give anything back when the license terminates. So to the extent that patent costs have been paid, fees have been paid, the university received equity, I think in almost all cases, that stays with the university after a termination of the license. And we'll go on to the next slide now, and Nikisha will talk more generally about obligations on termination.
Okay. So what are the startup obligations on termination? Well, first, they must stop using the license rights unless it's been otherwise agreed to in the license agreement. They have to pay what's owed, which is typically outlined in the final report and/or audit. Understand the disposition on existing products. Can the company continue to sell products in stock that they have in stock until they're all sold or for a limited period of time? So I have an example. For instance, if 6 months prior to the termination of an agreement, the company has 10,000 units of a product made, and at the time of termination, there were 3,000 units of the products remaining. What does the agreement say about what the company can do with those products after termination? Can they sell until they exhaust all the products and then pay the university the appropriate royalties, or must they immediately cease product sales? So understanding these provisions is important. Confidentiality, either return or destroy that information, and Lisa will provide more information on the next slide. Understanding what happens to sublicenses after termination, and Rick provided us with a great overview. Generally, it either terminates or becomes its own license directly to the university. And what right does the company have to use know-how, trade secrets, material after the agreement is done? If the right to use IP that is not a patent has not been agreed upon, then there may be a need by the licensee, to utilize those rights for whatever reason, then a separate agreement may need to be reached between the parties. And this may be largely determined by the reason for termination. So did the company terminate for any one of the reasons that Rick outlined? Or did the university terminate the agreement for cause? If the university terminated the agreement for cause, it may be less willing to allocate those rights after the termination. And finally, understanding survival clause. A survival clause or survival provision is a contractual clause which allows the parties to mutually agree to maintain the enforceability and legal binding status of certain contractual obligations past the expiration and termination of the contract. The effect of the survival clause is that the parties remain legally obligated to one another even after the contract has ended. And these are certain protections that remain in place sometimes for the benefit of both parties. For instance, if there's a dispute that occurs during the agreement that ultimately results in termination and or subsequent litigation, which can continue for years and years. If the disputes language survives the termination of the agreement, then the parties must continue towards that dispute resolution per the agreed upon route. We have here listed some typical clauses that survive termination. And again, these are some of the same some of the same considerations that we talked about in the sublicensing clause. These are considerations that tend to be very important for the university. And I also mentioned dispute resolution reference. And previously, as I mentioned, Lisa will provide us a bit more information on confidential information, unless anyone has any more comments.
Yeah, I just have one comment to make. This is one thing I'm always thinking about in this is that if the license includes both patents and other things, know-how, trade secrets, materials, software, is that at some point the royalty obligations, if it goes to its natural expiration term, patents expired and maybe there's a period of time after, of maybe so many years after commercial sale, and the royalty obligations expire and the license kind of comes to its natural expiration point, in that case, it may be important for the startup to be able to keep using that know-how, trade secrets, materials, at this point, it's something that's buried deep in the product. It's, you know, the agreement is maybe decades old, and no one, you know, it's hard to figure out what's in or not. And often it's going to be in the startup's interest to say, okay, if the license terminates, that's one thing. But if the license expires and we've paid royalties through the royalty term for the use of those materials, et cetera, that we should be able to just keep using them after that. That right to use should survive.
So we're going to actually, the next slide is about confidentiality, but we're going to move that to the next session because we actually have 7 questions that we haven't answered yet from our audience, and I'd really like for us to get to those in our last 5 minutes. So I'm going to direct the first question to Lisa, and this goes back to term. We have a number of questions on term. What about term length for trademarks? How does that work?
Right, and so I had seen this question and thought I could answer it quickly. We had a license that included patents, copyrights, and trademarks. It was for a process of evaluating mass spectrometry data. That was what was covered in the patent. There was related software of how that would actually happen in the system. And then a bit unusually, we already had a trademark, trade name that was associated with that process. So the patents expired long ago, expired probably 6 or 7 years ago. So the royalty at that time dropped because then the license was really just based on the code and the trademark. And really, as you can imagine, the code having been 20 years old had been rewritten so many times that really primarily our royalties are based on the trademark. So the trademark, different than an expiration where you'd have for a patent or a copyright based on that content, the trademark can be renewed. And so it's renewable as long as that mark is being used in commerce. And so on some level, it can almost be eternal as long as products are still being made with the use of that mark.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Next question, and I'm going to direct this one to Rick. Is the patent term payment only an issue in the US? Is it also an issue in other countries?
I'm not aware the cases that Nikisha cited to are US Supreme Court cases that limit the enforceability of the payment of royalties after patent expiration. I'm not familiar with whether there's any cases like that overseas.
Okay.
I don't think there's a restriction in Europe.
Okay.
I don't believe there's that.
And maybe if anyone does know, they can chime in to us, and so we can also look this up and follow up with people afterwards too. So. And then the next question was also about term, and it says, unless trade secrets / materials are explicitly involved, is it possible for a license and associated royalties to survive beyond the last valid claim?
I think that speaks to the legalities, at least in US. If there are no valid claims and there isn't any additional IP associated with the agreement, then the term of the agreement and the appropriate royalty term will expire or terminate at the end of the patent life.
I will say the only sort of exception to that is, as we were talking about sell-off. So if the patent has expired, but products were made before the expiration and those are being sold off, that'll be written in that we would still have royalties on that, but that's the only exception I can think of.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna, so I'm just gonna remind the audience, if you can fill out our survey, which just appeared in your chat box. We look at all these surveys and we really base our webinars on them and make changes to our webinars based on them. So there's a survey link. We have a few more questions we're gonna try to get to. This one, I'm just gonna go through quickly. How often have you seen universities getting undiluted equity? So university practices differ with regards to equity and the percentages they're taking and whether they take an anti-dilution. Usually the anti-dilution is capped at a certain amount if they do take anti-dilution. I'd say more often than not these days universities have an anti-dilution clause, but it really depends, one, on the university's practices, and two, the industry area and how the company plans to get its funding with how anti-dilution works for the universities. So unless anyone else wants to add to that, I'm going to go to the next question.
The question does ask about undiluted equity.
Undiluted, yeah.
And so there are cases where sometimes this gets more to like the liquidity fee concept, and where as a backstop, the university will negotiate something where it'll say get 0.5%, which isn't really equity. I mean, you'll never see undilutable equity. That's just that's not. But you can kind of get a proxy for it in a liquidity fee that's tied to a portion, a percentage. And those are always, whenever I've seen those sub one, I mean, with one university exception, sub 1%, as a backstop.
Right. Totally agree with Rick. Next goes to back to the reservation of rights. So early on in this webinar, hour and a half ago, with regards to nonprofits potentially having rights through these reservation of rights. I don't know if you saw this question or not, Lisa, but those reservation of rights are actually usually pretty specific on who actually the rights are reserved for. Could you go into that a little bit, and then also into commercial versus non-commercial research?
Sure. So for commercial versus non-commercial research, that essentially is something, if it would be funded by the NSF or NSH, that's typically non-commercial research, right? We're looking at things that are basic research. You're identifying a process or a methodology, as opposed to you're working out the ergonomics of a product, or you're going into manufacturing and development. And it certainly can be more nuanced than that, but that's really what we're looking at. Is this advancing the science, or is it advancing the product? So that's how we're making those distinctions. And also, of course, like who's sponsoring the work, who's promoting that work. And then, so the first question was on who's
nonprofit.
Yeah, so I understand that some not-for-profits or some commercial entities appear as not-for-profits. It's really not what this is intended to protect. That really does go back to the nature of the research that's being done. So we look at that. The intent, I'll just say, it's not to the university's benefit to be researching away from our licensee. So if there's something that would run counter to the interest of that, that's not something that we would enter into. And I would say definitely our researchers feel the same, that it's more likely that the licensee is going to sponsor research that would be on the development than that we would bring in somebody else that would be working on a parallel or competitive route. And they're also, depending on the agreement, and I would say often for our startups, there's a window of time. For us, it's a year, where improvements to the technology can be included in the license after a pretty simple process. So again, though, we're really trying to make sure that we have everybody's best interest in moving a product out most quickly. Generally, that's through our licensee.
I'm sorry we're over time, but we have one last question. I want to get to it before we go. And it's about, what are the concerns with faculty who are involved with the startup signing option and license agreements? And Lisa, do you want to take that first? And then Nikisha and Rick, I'm sure you also have.
Sure. So that really relates directly to our conflict of interest policy. The researcher has been hired by the university to do research, and this is typically not that, right? They'd be getting a personal benefit through the nature of the agreement. And so that's where that conflict comes in, but they're not then acting on behalf of the university, they're acting on their own benefit. And it also, by not having them be a signatory, it also provides them a safe harbor in case there are any concerns about that as well.
I agree, concur.
Rick, anything else?
The one observation I'd make is universities' policies really differ a lot from university to university, kind of it's a bit all over the map. And some of the concerns just are that you're a university employee and a representative, you shouldn't be on the opposite side of the table, and that creates this inherent conflict of interest. Some universities take that position, others don't.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. Sorry we went a little long today, everyone, but thanks for sticking with us. Thank you so much to our panelists once again for putting this amazing content together. Thank you to our audience for asking such terrific questions today. And we have our next session on September 9th. This is the outline of it. Obviously, we'll be adding the confidentiality part that we didn't get to today as well. And we hope to see everyone then. Thanks so much for attending today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.